I never thought I'd be the guy telling one of these stories. Honestly, I always believed the hard work and sacrifices I put into my life would safeguard me from betrayal. That belief? Gone. Torn to shreds in a way that left me questioning everything I stood for. I don't share this for sympathy. I don't need that. I share it because maybe someone else out there will see the signs I missed. Let me start with some context. I'm a former Marine. I'm no stranger to chaos or pressure, and I've built my life around loyalty, protection, and honor. Those aren't just words to me. They're the foundation of who I am. My wife, Allison, knew that about me from the start. We met 9 years ago when her family was going through a tough time. Her dad had just lost his job, and they were barely holding on to their house. I'd been back from my second deployment for about a year, working construction and trying to transition into civilian life. We met at a friend's barbecue. She was gorgeous, funny, and had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. When she told me about her family's struggles, I felt this urge to help. It wasn't about being a savior or anything like that. It was just who I was. Fast forward a year. We were married, and I built a guest house on our property for her parents. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable and gave them a fresh start. I didn't think twice about it. Allison's gratitude was all I needed. For years, I thought we were solid. I worked hard, long hours managing a construction crew, to give us a good life. I made sure she never had to worry about bills or anything else. Allison worked part-time as a yoga instructor, but mostly, she focused on things like decorating the house, planning vacations, and volunteering. I never minded. I liked being the provider. It made me feel like I was fulfilling my duty as a husband. But looking back, there were cracks I didn't see. Or maybe I ignored them. Little things. Like how she'd roll her eyes when I talked about work, or how she started spending more time out, running errands. I chalked it up to normal marriage stuff. You know, the routine wear and tear of life. About 6 months ago, things shifted. She became distant, almost cold. Conversations felt forced, and she started nitpicking everything I did. I couldn't even load the dishwasher without her commenting on how I was doing it wrong. At first, I thought she was just stressed, so I tried to give her space. She began to pull away, not all at once, but little by little. At first it was little things. Not holding my hand when we went somewhere, waving me away when I leaned in for a kiss. Then it got bigger. She avoided any intimacy at all, saying she was too tired or not in the mood. I tried to be understanding. Teaching is not an easy job, and I knew she was stressed. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to feel like I was living with my roommate instead of my wife. Then came the late-night texts. At first, I didn't think much of them. She said they were from her yoga group chat, and I had no reason not to believe her. But the way she'd turn her phone away from me, or the fact that she always seemed to smile just a little too much while typing, those things started to eat at me. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to be that guy, the insecure husband. But one night, curiosity got the better of me. She'd fallen asleep with her phone on the nightstand, and something inside me just snapped. I picked it up, unlocked it. She never changed her passcode, and went straight to her messages. What I saw made my stomach drop. She wasn't texting her yoga group. She was texting a guy named Sean. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. It was clear there was something going on. Stuff like, "I can't stop thinking about today," and "You make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years." I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the living room, staring at the wall, trying to process it. Who was this guy? How long had this been going on? Was it just emotional, or had it crossed the line into something physical? My mind spiraled with questions I didn't want the answers to. The next day, I went to work as usual. I didn't say a word to Allison. I wasn't ready to confront her, not until I had more information. That weekend, I made up some excuse about needing to work on site and spent most of Saturday parked outside a gym she'd started going to. Sure enough, Sean was there. He wasn't anything special, just some guy in his early 30s, tall, fit, and cocky in that way that guys like him always seem to be. I watched as she walked out of the gym and got into his car. They drove off together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. That night, I confronted her. I didn't yell or scream. I just laid it out. Told her I knew about Sean and asked her to explain. At first, she tried to deny it, but when I mentioned the texts and seeing them together, she broke down. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said through tears. It just happened. I felt so alone, and he made me feel special. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. Alone? I'd spent the last 9 years building a life for us, sacrificing my time, my energy, my everything. And she felt alone? It was like all those years of loyalty and dedication meant nothing. I moved out that night, packed a bag, and stayed at a buddy's place. The next few weeks were a blur of anger, sadness, and disbelief. She begged me to come home, saying it was a mistake, that she'd end it with Sean. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't look at her without seeing her betrayal. The hardest part has been dealing with her parents. They still live in the guest house, and they've tried to stay neutral, but I can tell they're caught in the middle. Her mom told me she's praying for us, but her dad hasn't said a word. I think he's ashamed of her. As for me, I'm trying to move forward, but it's not easy. I've started therapy, which helps, and I'm leaning on my friends more than ever. The toughest part is knowing that no matter how much I gave, it wasn't enough. And maybe that's the lesson here. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, some people just don't value what you bring to the table. I'm not sure what the future holds, but one thing's for sure. I'll never lose sight of my own worth again. I've always been a creature of habit. My days were defined by discipline, drilled into me from years in the Marines. Rising at dawn for an intense workout, putting in long hours at the construction site, then coming home to unwind with Allison. Routine kept me grounded. It gave me purpose. I thought it was the glue holding everything together. Turns out, I was wrong. For years, I thrived in my role as a do-gooder and problem solver. I was the guy everyone called when something needed fixing, whether it was a leaky roof or a broken family relationship. That's how I approached life. See a problem, fix it. It gave me a sense of pride, knowing I could create stability for those I loved. But cracks had been forming beneath the surface, even if I didn't see them. Or maybe I refused to see them. Looking back, there were signs. Little inconsistencies. Red flags I dismissed as paranoia or stress. Take her phone, for example. A year ago, she started guarding it like it held nuclear launch codes. Before, it was always lying around the house, on the coffee table, the kitchen counter, the bathroom sink. She never cared if I picked it up to check the weather or look something up. But then she started keeping it on her at all times. I'd joke about it, asking if she was planning to elope with the delivery guy, and she'd laugh it off. Privacy's important, she'd say, flashing that sweet smile. And I bought it. Another thing, her appearance. Allison had always been beautiful. Yoga instructor beautiful, with the kind of effortless grace that made strangers do double takes. But over the past year, she started dressing differently. Not just nice, but trying too hard nice. Tight jeans, low-cut tops, makeup that was a little too perfect. She said it was for her self-confidence, and maybe that was true. But part of me couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't dressing for me anymore. Then there was her schedule. Allison's yoga classes had always been predictable, 2 mornings a week and 1 evening class. But suddenly, she was teaching extra sessions, filling in for other instructors, or attending workshops. The hours got longer, and so did the excuses. I tried not to read too much into it. I mean, I'm a logical guy. It's easy to let your imagination run wild, especially when you're married. People warn you about this kind of stuff, how jealousy can creep in and poison everything. So I told myself I was overthinking it. But the late nights were harder to ignore. I'd come home from work, dead tired, and she'd be out. Sometimes she'd text to say she was grabbing drinks with friends after class. Other times, she wouldn't bother texting at all. I'd sit in our living room, nursing a beer, wondering what the hell had changed. I told myself it was just a phase. Maybe she needed space. Maybe I wasn't doing enough to make her feel appreciated. So I doubled down. I started helping more around the house, washing dishes, folding laundry, fixing things before she had to ask. I made an effort to compliment her, even on the days when she barely acknowledged me. Still, something felt off. One night, she came home smelling like a cologne I didn't recognize. Not mine, that's for damn sure. I asked her about it, and she laughed, brushing it off as a new essential oil they were using at the studio. I wanted to believe her, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. The tipping point came about 2 months ago. I had a day off work, rare for me, and decided to surprise her by picking her up from her yoga class. I parked outside the studio, watching people trickle out, mats slung over their shoulders. But Allison never came out. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. 30. Finally, I got out of the truck and walked inside. The receptionist gave me a confused look when I asked if Allison was still there. She didn't teach today, she said. I think she mentioned taking the day off. I left without saying another word, my chest tight and my mind racing. Where was she? Why had she lied? That night, I didn't confront her. I couldn't. I needed more proof, something concrete to back up the gnawing feeling in my gut. So I started paying attention, watching for patterns, taking mental notes of every inconsistency. One Saturday, she said she was meeting a friend for coffee. I pretended to believe her, then followed her instead. She didn't go to a coffee shop. She went to a hotel. I parked a block away, my hands shaking as I watched her walk inside. She was wearing that dress, the one I bought her for our anniversary, the one she hadn't worn for me in over a year. She was in there for 2 hours. 2 long hours. I sat in my truck, heart pounding, mind racing with every worst-case scenario. When she finally came out, she wasn't alone. She was with a man, a guy I didn't recognize, but everything about him screamed smarmy confidence. They didn't kiss or touch, but they didn't have to. The way she looked at him, the way she laughed at whatever he was saying, it was all I needed to see. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed next to her, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the hell we'd gotten here. How the woman I'd built my life around, the woman I'd sacrificed for, could betray me like this. I haven't confronted her yet. I'm not ready. Maybe I'm scared of what she'll say, or maybe I'm scared of what it'll mean for my life if I walk away. Because here's the thing. As much as I hate what she's done, part of me still loves her. And that's the cruelest part of all. For now, I'm playing the long game. Watching. Waiting. Gathering my strength for the confrontation I know is coming. Because once I start that conversation, there's no going back. It was a Wednesday morning like any other, or so I thought. I was up at dawn, finishing a set of deadlifts in the garage gym when my phone buzzed on the workbench. I almost ignored it, figuring it was one of those spam calls trying to sell me solar panels or extend my truck's non-existent warranty. But something made me pick it up. Hey man, this is Dave from next door, the voice said. Now, I didn't know Dave all that well. We waved at each other in passing, exchanged pleasantries about the weather when taking out the trash, but that was about it. So, hearing his voice on the other end of the line immediately put me on alert. Morning, Dave. What's up? I said, wiping the sweat off my face with a towel. There was a pause, the kind that makes you uncomfortable, like the other person is deciding whether or not to say something that might stir up trouble. Look, I don't want to overstep, Dave began. But I thought you should know. I've noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside the guest house the last few mornings. Figured maybe you had a contractor working on something, but then I saw the guy coming and going. Just didn't sit right with me, you know? I tried to keep my voice steady. What kind of car? A black BMW. Newer model. The guy driving it's younger, maybe late 30s. He doesn't look like one of your in-laws, if you get what I mean. I thanked him and hung up, brushing it off as paranoia. It wasn't like I didn't trust Dave. He seemed like a stand-up guy, but I couldn't go jumping to conclusions every time someone parked in front of the guest house. My in-laws had friends and visitors too. But as I went about my morning, his words stuck with me like a splinter in my brain. By lunch, I couldn't shake the image of that black BMW. Was it just coincidence? Or was it the same car I'd seen drop off Allison at the end of our street last week? She'd said it was one of her yoga friends giving her a ride because her car needed an oil change. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, the seed of doubt Dave planted started to grow. When I got home that evening, I decided to take a closer look. The guest house was quiet, the curtains drawn. My in-laws weren't the kind to throw parties or have unexpected company. If anything, they were as predictable as I was. My father-in-law, George, spent most days tinkering with his woodshop projects. My mother-in-law, Karen, liked to garden or watch true crime documentaries. I walked out to the edge of the yard under the pretense of checking the sprinkler system. There were no cars parked out front, but I noticed something odd. The trash bins by the guest house were overflowing with takeout bags and 2 empty bottles of wine. Not their usual style. Karen was all about home cooking, and George didn't drink anything stronger than sweet tea. Still, I told myself it didn't mean anything. People change their habits, right? But the doubts didn't stop. The next day, I left work a little early and parked a block away from home, where I could see the guest house driveway. I felt ridiculous, like one of those nosy neighbors with nothing better to do. But this was different. This was my family, my marriage, my life on the line. Around 4:30, a black BMW pulled up. My heart sank as I watched a guy step out, mid-30s, dressed too sharply for someone just swinging by to say hello. He glanced around, almost nervously, before heading inside the guest house. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to think straight. Maybe he was a contractor or an old friend of George's. Maybe this was all just one big misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew. I waited until the guy left, about an hour later, then walked over and knocked on the guest house door. Karen answered, smiling warmly like nothing was wrong. "Hey, Mike," she said. "What a nice surprise." I forced a smile. "Just thought I'd stop by and see how you guys are doing." She let me in, and everything looked normal, except for the faint smell of cologne lingering in the air. Not George's. Not mine. "Everything okay?" I asked casually, scanning the room for anything out of place. "Of course," Karen said, her tone light and breezy. "Just the usual. George is out back working on his latest project." "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, not wanting to show my hand just yet. "No reason. Just making sure everyone's good." We chatted for a few minutes before I excused myself and headed home. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen knew more than she was letting on. That night, I decided I couldn't keep playing the waiting game. If something was happening, if Allison was sneaking around, if her parents were covering for her, I needed to know. And I needed to know now. The next morning, I called in sick and set up shop in my truck down the block, just out of sight. I had a clear view of the guest house and our front yard. I felt a little crazy, sitting there with a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars like some amateur detective, but I didn't care. Around noon, the BMW showed up again. Same guy. This time, he didn't go into the guest house. He went straight to my front door. Allison opened it, wearing that dress again, the one she used to wear for me. She glanced around nervously before pulling him inside. My stomach churned as I watched the door close behind them. I don't remember how long I sat there, frozen, staring at the house. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. All I could think about was how blind I'd been, how much I'd ignored the signs because I didn't want to face the truth. When they finally came out, laughing and smiling like nothing was wrong, I didn't move. I just watched as they got into his car and drove off. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed at a buddy's place, trying to figure out my next move. Confronting Allison wasn't just about calling her out. It was about dismantling the life I'd built, the life I thought we shared. But now, thanks to Dave's call, there was no denying it. The life I thought I had was a lie. I don't think anything could have prepared me for what I saw that afternoon. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just blindside you. It hits like a freight train, leaving a wreckage of your emotions scattered in every direction. That day, I learned what it felt like to hit rock bottom. It started like any other workday. I woke up early, went through my usual routine, and headed to the construction site. But something felt off. It wasn't just the lingering doubts or the weight of the suspicions I'd been carrying. It was a gut feeling I couldn't shake. Around lunchtime, I made an excuse to my foreman and decided to head home early. I needed answers, and I was tired of waiting for them to fall into my lap. The drive home was tense, like something was building in the air. When I pulled into the driveway, everything seemed normal enough. Allison's car was there, and the house looked just as I'd left it. But then I noticed the guest house. The curtains were drawn, and for some reason, it struck me as odd. Karen always kept them open during the day to let in sunlight. I parked the truck and stood there for a moment, staring at the guest house. The knot in my stomach tightened with every step I took toward it. At first, I didn't hear anything. But as I got closer, muffled voices filtered through the walls. Laughter, hers, and the unmistakable low rumble of a man's voice. It wasn't George. I knew that much. My heart started pounding. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't ready for what I found when I pushed the door open. There they were. Allison and an older guy I recognized immediately, Richard, an old family friend of her father's. He was sitting on the couch like he owned the place, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down, a smug grin plastered across his face. And Allison? She was sitting way too close to him, her hand on his leg, looking at him like he hung the moon. When they saw me, her eyes went wide, and she jumped up, stammering something about how it wasn't what it looked like. But the truth was plain as day. Richard, on the other hand, didn't even flinch. He leaned back, all calm and collected, like he was trying to taunt me. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a growl. Allison tried to come up with some excuse, but I wasn't listening. My focus was on Richard, this guy who had the audacity to sit in my house, in the guest house I'd built with my own hands, and act like he belonged there. "Relax, man," Richard said, smirking like he was enjoying the show. "It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. Those 4 words were all it took to snap the last thread of control I had. Before I knew it, I was on him, my fist connecting with his jaw. He went down hard, but I wasn't done. "You think you can come into my house and do this?" I shouted, grabbing him by the collar. He tried to shove me off, but he was no match for the adrenaline-fueled rage coursing through me. He swung at me once, but it was weak, and I dodged it easily. My second punch landed squarely on his mouth, and I felt the crunch of teeth beneath my knuckles. He let out a garbled cry, blood spilling from his busted lip. Allison was screaming, but her voice was just background noise to me. All I could see was this man, the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in my life. He had disrespected me in the worst way possible, and in that moment, all I wanted was to make him pay. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe a minute, maybe less. But when I finally let go of him, he was a mess. His face swollen, his lips split, and at least one tooth missing. He stumbled to his feet, wiping at the blood on his face, and spat out, "You're insane." "You haven't seen insane yet," I said, my voice low and steady. He didn't stick around to test that theory. He grabbed his shirt and bolted for the door, muttering curses under his breath as he went. I followed him out, making sure he got the hell off my property. When I turned back to the guest house, Allison was standing there, her face pale and tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mike, I'm sorry," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't. Just don't," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of everything I was feeling. I didn't want to hear her excuses or apologies. There was nothing she could say that would undo what I'd just seen. I left without another word, walking back to the main house to grab my keys and wallet. I needed space, time to think, to process everything. The woman I'd devoted my life to, the woman I'd sacrificed for, had thrown it all away for some washed-up family friend. That night, I stayed at a motel, staring at the ceiling and replaying the scene over and over in my head. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, one I wasn't sure would ever heal. But one thing was clear. The life I thought I'd built with Allison was over. And no matter how much it hurt, I knew I couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies. The motel room was dark and quiet, except for the low hum of the AC unit rattling in the corner. I'd barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was Allison with him, her hand on his leg, the way she looked at him. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. That realization hurt the most. By the time the sun came up, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding her. I had to confront her. Not because I wanted to hear her excuses, I didn't, but because I needed to make her face the destruction she'd caused. I drove back to the house around mid-morning, half hoping she wouldn't be there. Part of me wanted to avoid the inevitable explosion, but the other part, the angrier part, needed answers. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw her car parked where it always was. She was sitting on the couch in the living room, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. When she saw me walk in, her eyes widened, and for a split second, I thought she might try to bolt. "Mike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I just stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to say something. Anything. She set the mug down on the coffee table and stood up, wringing her hands like she didn't know what to do with them. I was going to call you, she started. Don't, I said, my voice low but steady. Don't insult me by pretending you were going to come clean. The words hung heavy in the air between us. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, like she didn't know where to start. It wasn't what it looked like, she finally said, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Are you serious? I asked, taking a step closer. I saw you with him, Allison. I saw everything. Don't you dare try to gaslight me right now. She broke then, her shoulders sagging as tears welled up in her eyes. It wasn't serious, she said, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking. Not thinking. I interrupted, my anger rising. You weren't thinking when you brought him into our house? When you smiled at him, laughed with him, touched him like he meant something to you? How many times, Allison? How many mistakes did you make? She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. It didn't mean anything, she said, her voice muffled. I never meant to hurt you. Then why? I demanded, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay calm. Why would you do this? I gave you everything, Allison. Everything. And this is how you repay me? She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked at me, her face was a mess of tears and guilt. I don't know, she said. I was lonely. You've been so busy with work, and I felt invisible. Invisible, I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. Do you know what I've been doing, Allison? Every long hour, every late night. It was all for us. For this house, this life we built together. And you're telling me you were lonely? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, Mike, I'll do anything to fix this. Her words sounded hollow, like she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the image of her with him, the way she looked at him, was burned into my brain. I shook my head, taking a step back. You don't get it, do you? I said. This isn't something you can just fix. You broke something, Allison. Something we'll never get back. How am I supposed to trust you after this? How am I supposed to believe anything you say? She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands again. It was a mistake, she repeated, like a mantra. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, it's over. It'll never happen again. I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. You think that matters to me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You think saying it's over erases what you did? You didn't just cheat on me, Allison. You betrayed me. You betrayed us. And for what? Some meaningless fling with a guy who doesn't even respect you enough to keep his hands off a married woman? She didn't respond. For the first time, I think she realized the depth of what she'd done, the gravity of it. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching her cry, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow determination. I'd spent years building a life with her, believing we were a team, and in one moment, she destroyed it. Finally, I spoke. I'm done, I said, my voice steady. I can't do this anymore. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face full of panic. Mike, no. Please, don't say that. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just don't leave. But it was too late. The damage was done, and no amount of begging or promises could undo it. I turned and walked toward the door, my heart heavy but resolute. You made your choice, Allison, I said, not bothering to look back. Now I'm making mine. I left the house without another word, knowing there was no going back. Years of military training taught me a lot of things. Discipline, resilience, and most of all, how to keep moving forward when everything feels like it's falling apart. But no amount of training prepared me for the gut-wrenching betrayal I just experienced. The thing about being a Marine is that you're built to endure, to adapt, and to overcome. And as much as Allison's betrayal cut deep, I knew I couldn't let it break me. I've always lived by a code. Loyalty, respect, honor. Those aren't just words to me. They're the principles I've built my life around. And when I told Allison, I don't let people into my life who don't respect me, I meant it. If she couldn't honor that, then she didn't deserve a place in my life. After walking out of the house that day, I didn't look back. I checked into a different motel, not wanting to stay anywhere familiar. I needed distance, not just from her, but from everything that reminded me of the life we'd built together. That first night alone, I sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed, staring at the wall and replaying everything in my head. I wasn't wallowing, I don't do that. But I needed to understand how I'd missed the signs. Had I been too caught up in work? Too trusting? Or was it simply that Allison wasn't the person I thought she was? The questions came in waves, but the answers didn't. And maybe that's what hurt the most, not knowing why. By morning, I decided to stop focusing on the why and start focusing on what came next. I had to take control of the situation to regain my self-respect and rebuild my life on my terms. The first step was cutting ties with Allison completely. The house was the biggest hurdle. Legally, it was mine. I'd bought the property before we got married. But emotionally, it was tied to too many memories, too many promises that had been broken. I didn't want to stay there, and I sure as hell didn't want her staying there either. I called a lawyer first thing in the morning. I wanted to know my options and how to handle this without it turning into a messy battle. The lawyer was sharp, straight to the point, which is exactly what I needed. He advised me to document everything: texts, emails, even photos if I had them. You need to be strategic, he said. Keep emotions out of it. This is about protecting yourself. I'd already started documenting the day I caught her with Richard. I had photos of his car parked outside the guest house, and I'd saved the messages I found on her phone months ago. I wasn't going to let her spin this into something it wasn't. The lawyer also advised me to start separating our finances immediately. Joint accounts were frozen that afternoon, and I opened a new one in my name. It felt cold, clinical even, but I knew it had to be done. When I told Allison about the accounts, she tried to argue. Mike, this isn't necessary. We can work through this. You don't have to make everything so final. But it was final. I wasn't interested in patching things up, not after what she'd done. This is what happens when you disrespect someone's trust, I told her. She cried, of course, but I didn't let it sway me. Her tears didn't mean anything to me anymore. One of the hardest parts of all this was figuring out what to do with the time that used to be filled with her. Marriage has a way of creating routines. Dinners together, weekends spent running errands, late-night conversations about nothing in particular. Now that those routines were gone, I had to fill the gaps with something else. I threw myself into work. My crew noticed the change right away, how I was more focused, more intense. One of the guys joked that I was running the site like a boot camp, but I didn't care. The physical labor and the mental challenge of managing projects kept me grounded. Outside of work, I leaned on my old habits: early morning workouts, long runs, and weekend hikes. I even signed up for a Spartan race, something I hadn't done since my early 30s. Training for it gave me a goal, something to work toward, and it reminded me of who I was before all of this, before her. As much as I tried to stay busy, the emotional fallout was harder to deal with. Betrayal messes with your head in ways you don't expect. It wasn't just the anger or the sadness. It was the self-doubt, the second-guessing. I'd catch myself wondering if I could have done something differently. If I'd been home more, been more attentive, would she have still cheated? But every time those thoughts crept in, I forced myself to remember. Her choices were her responsibility, not mine. I also started therapy. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but a buddy of mine from the Marines suggested it. You've been through worse, he said, but this kind of thing eats at you if you don't deal with it. The therapist was a no-nonsense guy, which I appreciated. He didn't coddle me or tell me to explore my feelings. Instead, he helped me focus on what I could control: my actions, my goals, and my boundaries. One thing he said stuck with me: self-respect isn't just about how others treat you. It's about how you treat yourself. Don't lose sight of that. By the time I sat down with Allison to finalize our separation, I felt like a different person, stronger, clearer, and more determined than I'd been in years. She still tried to salvage things. She wrote me letters, left voicemails, even had her parents try to talk to me. But I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses anymore. I'd given her my loyalty, my trust, and my love, and she'd thrown it all away. When I told her I was filing for divorce, she broke down completely. "Mike, please," she begged. "Don't do this. I know I messed up, but we can fix it. I'll do whatever it takes." But I'd already made up my mind. I wasn't the kind of man who let people take advantage of him, who stayed in toxic situations out of guilt or fear. I'd spent too many years sacrificing for others to start sacrificing my self-respect now. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Allison," I said, standing firm. "But it's not going to be with me." As I walked out of that room, I felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't over, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally back in control of my life. After everything came crashing down, I started seeing my life differently. Betrayal has a way of sharpening your perspective. It forces you to look at things you might have ignored, taken for granted, or simply assumed were the way they were supposed to be. For me, that meant questioning everything. And a big part of that questioning involved her parents, Karen and George. They'd always seemed so grateful for what I'd done for them. I mean, who wouldn't be? I'd built them a damn guest house when they were on the brink of losing everything. I'd put in the hours, the sweat, and the money because Allison had asked me to, and because I wanted to be the kind of husband who took care of his family. That's how I was raised. But now, in the aftermath of Allison's betrayal, I couldn't help but wonder. How much did they know? Were they just as blindsided as I was, or had they been turning a blind eye to what was happening under their roof? It started as a nagging thought, the kind that creeps in when you're lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling. I replayed every interaction I'd had with Karen and George over the past few months, looking for clues I might have missed. Karen had always been friendly, almost overly so. She'd gush about how much she appreciated everything I'd done for their family, how lucky Allison was to have me. But there'd been moments, subtle things, that didn't sit right with me now. Like the way she'd change the subject whenever I mentioned Allison's increasingly erratic schedule, or how she'd avoid eye contact when I joked about the mystery car parked outside the guest house. And George? He was the quiet type, more comfortable with a hammer and nails than conversation. But even he had seemed off. I couldn't pinpoint it at the time, but now I wondered if his silence had been guilt. I decided to confront them. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I couldn't move forward without answers. It was a Sunday afternoon when I walked over to the guest house. Karen was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for what smelled like a pot of chili. George was out back, tinkering with his latest project, a birdhouse, I think. Karen looked up when I stepped inside, her face breaking into a smile. "Mike, what a nice surprise. Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" "No, thanks," I said, keeping my tone even. "I just need to talk to you and George for a minute." Her smile faltered, but she nodded. "George," she called out the back door. "Mike's here. Come on in." A few minutes later, we were all sitting around the small dining table. I didn't waste any time. "How long did you know?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. Karen blinked, clearly taken aback. "Know what?" "Don't play dumb," I said, leaning forward. "The affair. Allison and Richard. How long did you know what was going on?" Karen's face went pale, and George shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The silence stretched on until it was almost unbearable. Finally, Karen spoke. "Mike, I swear, we didn't know. Not at first." "Not at first," I repeated, my jaw tightening. "So when did you know?" She hesitated, glancing at George for support. He just stared at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. "It was a few weeks ago," Karen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them together, in the driveway. I didn't realize what was going on until then." "And you didn't think to tell me?" I asked, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You just let it happen?" Karen's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what to do," she said. I thought maybe it was just a one-time thing. I didn't want to ruin your marriage." I laughed bitterly. "You didn't want to ruin my marriage?" Newsflash, Karen. Allison already did that. You could have given me a heads up instead of letting me walk around like an idiot." George finally spoke, his voice gruff and defensive. It wasn't our place to get involved, Mike. This is between you and Allison. I stared at him, disbelief coursing through me. Not your place? I built this house for you. I've bent over backward to help this family, and you couldn't even give me the courtesy of the truth? George had the decency to look ashamed, but he didn't apologize. That pissed me off even more. After that conversation, I couldn't look at Karen and George the same way. They weren't just innocent bystanders in all of this. They'd known, and they'd chosen to stay silent. Maybe they thought they were protecting their daughter, but in doing so, they betrayed me too. I started reevaluating everything, every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd spent, every hour I'd poured into making their lives easier. I'd done it out of love for Allison, but where had that love gotten me? In the end, it was clear that my generosity had been taken for granted. I decided I wasn't going to support them anymore. The guest house? It was time for them to find somewhere else to live. I didn't make that decision lightly, but I knew it was the right thing to do. When I told Karen and George, they didn't take it well. Karen cried, pleading with me to reconsider. Mike, where will we go? We can't afford to move right now. That's not my problem, I said firmly. I've done more than enough for this family, and look where it got me. It's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. George tried to argue, but I shut him down. You had a choice, George. You could have done the right thing. Instead, you stayed silent. You don't get to guilt me into letting you stay. Once Karen and George moved out, I felt a strange sense of relief. The guest house, once a symbol of my dedication to Allison and her family, was now just an empty building. But it wasn't my burden anymore. I started making plans to sell the property. Staying there, surrounded by memories of what could have been, wasn't an option. I needed a fresh start, a clean slate. Looking back, I realized that my biggest mistake wasn't trusting Allison or even her parents. It was forgetting to value myself in the process. I'd spent so much time putting others first, trying to be the provider, the protector, that I'd lost sight of my own needs. But not anymore. This betrayal had broken me, but it also gave me clarity. It reminded me of what I stood for and what I was willing to tolerate. And most importantly, it showed me that I deserved better, not just in a partner, but in every aspect of my life. After Karen and George moved out of the guest house, I felt like I'd finally cleared some of the wreckage from my life. But as much as I tried to move forward, there was one thing that kept nagging at me. The man she had been involved with. Richard. He wasn't just some random fling. He was more than that, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how deliberate this entire betrayal had been. It wasn't just about Allison. It was about him, too. I couldn't shake the need to dig deeper. Not because I thought it would change anything. It wouldn't. But because I needed to know the truth. I couldn't leave this part of my life behind without understanding how it had all fallen apart. What I knew about Richard wasn't much. He was an old friend of George's, someone Allison's parents had known for years. I remembered meeting him once or twice at family gatherings. He was one of those guys who always seemed to have a story to tell, usually about some business deal or exotic vacation. I never paid him much attention because, frankly, he struck me as a blowhard. But now, looking back, I started seeing things I hadn't noticed before. Like the way he'd always found a reason to linger when Allison was around. Or how he'd look at her, his gaze lingering a little too long to be polite. At the time, I chalked it up to him being a creep, but now I realized it was something more. I started asking around. Carefully, though. I didn't want to air all my dirty laundry, but I needed answers. One of the first places I looked was social media. It's amazing what you can find if you dig deep enough. Richard's profile wasn't private, which made things easier. Most of his posts were what I expected. Photos of him posing with expensive cars, drinks at fancy restaurants, and captions that made him sound like he was living the dream. But there were a few things that stood out, like photos of him at the guest house. One post, in particular, made my stomach turn. It was a picture of a glass of wine sitting on the counter of my kitchen. The caption read, "A cozy evening at my favorite escape." The date on the post? From 6 months ago. 6 months. The affair had been going on that long, at least. The more I looked into him, the more I realized just how intertwined he was with Allison's family. He wasn't just George's friend. He was practically part of their inner circle. He and George had gone to high school together, stayed in touch through the years, and apparently, he'd been a regular visitor to their home long before I ever met Allison. I found out that he'd even been around when Allison was younger, though the idea of that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a complete violation of trust. I started putting the pieces together. Richard's visits to the guest house hadn't been random. They weren't just the casual drop-ins of an old family friend. He'd been using that space as his playground, right under my nose, and George and Karen had let it happen. The more I learned, the angrier I got. Not just at Allison, but at her parents, too. They'd invited this man into their lives, into my life, and then looked the other way while he destroyed everything I'd built. One night, after a long day at work, I sat down with a notebook and started writing everything out. Dates, details, connections, anything I could think of that tied Richard to this mess. I needed to see it all laid out, to make sense of how it had gotten to this point. As I wrote, a pattern began to emerge. Richard's visits had started becoming more frequent around the time Allison began teaching extra yoga classes. That was the same time she'd started dressing differently, acting colder toward me, and guarding her phone like it was a state secret. It was clear now that she hadn't been going to yoga. She'd been meeting him. And the guest house, the one I'd built with my own hands, had been their meeting place. I felt sick. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the planning, the effort they'd put into deceiving me. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment fling. This was calculated. I reached out to a mutual friend of Allison's family, someone I trusted to give me the unfiltered truth. I'll call her Lisa. She was someone I'd gotten to know through Allison, but she'd always been more my friend than hers. When I asked Lisa about Richard, she hesitated. "Mike, are you sure you want to go down this road?" she asked. "I need to know," I said. She sighed and then told me everything. According to Lisa, Richard had always had a thing for Allison. It was kind of an open secret, she said. He'd flirt with her, compliment her, and George would just laugh it off, like it was no big deal. "And Karen?" I asked. "She didn't approve," Lisa admitted, "but she never said anything. I think she was afraid of rocking the boat." Lisa also confirmed what I'd suspected. The affair had been going on for months, maybe even longer. "I don't know the exact timeline," she said, "but I remember seeing them together at a party last year. They were close." Close. That word felt like a punch to the gut. By the time I'd pieced everything together, I felt like I'd been living in a fog for years. How could I have been so blind? So trusting? But instead of wallowing in self-pity, I channeled that anger into action. I filed for divorce the following week, including every detail I'd uncovered about the affair in the paperwork. I wasn't going to let Allison or Richard walk away from this unscathed. I also started making plans to sell the house. Staying there wasn't an option anymore, not after everything that had happened. I needed a fresh start, somewhere far away from the memories of Allison, Richard, and her enabling parents. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was taking back control of my life. The truth hurt, but it also set me free. The day I filed for divorce felt like both an ending and a beginning. It was the official step in cutting Allison out of my life, but it also symbolized something bigger, reclaiming my sense of self. For too long, I'd been weighed down by her betrayal, by the lies and the deceit that had unraveled everything I thought we had. Filing the papers was my way of saying, enough. Enough of the excuses, the guilt, and the constant questioning of what I could have done differently. The courthouse was quieter than I expected, and the process was surprisingly clinical. I handed over the paperwork to the clerk, who stamped it with a mechanical efficiency that felt almost surreal. It hit me then. This wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the start of a new chapter. I walked out of there with a sense of finality, but also determination. If Allison had taught me anything, it was the importance of setting boundaries, firm ones. Not just with her, but with everyone in my life. Karen and George were next on my list. For years, I'd gone out of my way to help them. Building the guest house had been my way of showing Allison that I was all in, that her family was my family. At the time, I'd thought of it as an investment in our future. But now, it felt like a monument to my misplaced trust. They'd been living there rent-free since the day it was finished. I paid the utilities, maintained the property, and never once asked for anything in return. I did it because I wanted to help, because I believed in being generous to those you care about. But generosity without respect is just being a doormat, and I wasn't going to let that happen anymore. When I called Karen and George over to talk, I could tell they were nervous. Maybe they'd heard about the divorce filing, or maybe they just sensed the shift in me. Either way, they knew something was coming. We sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Karen was the first to speak. "Mike, we just want you to know how sorry we are about everything," she said, her voice trembling. "We had no idea things were this bad between you and Allison." I held up a hand to stop her. "This isn't about apologies," I said. "What's done is done. But we need to talk about the guest house." George frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "What about it?" I took a deep breath, keeping my tone steady. "I've decided to sell the property. That includes the guest house." Karen's face fell, and George stiffened. "Sell it? Mike, where are we supposed to go?" Karen asked, her voice tinged with panic. "That's not my responsibility," I said firmly. "I've supported you both for years, and I did it willingly. But things have changed. My kindness has been taken for granted, and I can't keep carrying that weight." Karen's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about being cruel. It was about setting boundaries. "I'm giving you 3 months to find a new place," I continued. "That should be enough time to figure things out. I'll even help you connect with a realtor or look into rental options if you need it. But staying here rent-free is no longer an option." George looked like he wanted to argue, but Karen put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She nodded, her expression resigned. "We understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for giving us some time." Once I'd set the wheels in motion with the divorce and the sale of the property, I started focusing on myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't living my life for someone else. I wasn't trying to fix their problems or carry their burdens. It was liberating, but also a little daunting. I poured myself into my work, taking on new projects and responsibilities that kept me busy and challenged. I also reconnected with old friends, people I drifted away from during my marriage. It felt good to have those familiar faces back in my life, to remember that I wasn't as alone as I'd felt during the worst of it. Therapy became a regular part of my routine, too. At first, I'd been skeptical. Talking about my feelings wasn't exactly my strong suit, but it helped. It gave me a space to process everything, to untangle the mess of emotions that came with being cheated on by someone you thought you could trust. One session, my therapist said something that stuck with me. "Setting boundaries isn't about shutting people out. It's about protecting your peace." That became my mantra. Selling the house was harder than I expected. Not because I was attached to it. I wasn't. But because it felt like closing the door on a part of my life I'd poured so much into. Every nail I'd hammered, every tile I'd laid, every inch of that property had been a labor of love. Letting it go felt bittersweet, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The sale went through quickly, and I used the money to buy a smaller place on the outskirts of town. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. No shared memories, no ghosts of the past, just a fresh start. I kept my distance from Allison during the divorce proceedings. She tried to reach out a few times, texts, voicemails, even a letter, but I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The final hearing was quick, almost anticlimactic. The judge signed off on the papers, and just like that, it was over. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. Looking back, I realized that Allison's betrayal had been a wake-up call. It forced me to confront not just the cracks in our marriage, but also the ways I'd let myself be taken advantage of. I'd spent so much time trying to be the provider, the protector, that I'd forgotten to protect myself. But now, I was doing just that. I was setting boundaries, focusing on my own happiness, and building a life that wasn't defined by someone else's mistakes. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. There's something about hitting rock bottom that strips everything away. The doubts, the fears, the excuses. You're left with nothing but yourself, and it's on you to decide what comes next. That's where I found myself after the divorce was finalized. I wasn't bitter or angry anymore. Those feelings had burned out, leaving behind something quieter, more determined. The first thing I did was take a long look in the mirror. Not literally, but metaphorically. I'd spent years defining myself by my roles: husband, provider, problem solver. And now that those roles were gone, I wasn't sure who I was. So I decided to find out. The gym became my second home. I'd always been disciplined about staying in shape, but now it was more than that. Every rep, every drop of sweat was a reminder that I was still strong, still capable. I started lifting heavier, running longer, pushing myself in ways I hadn't since my days in the Marines. It wasn't just about the physical changes, though those were satisfying. It was about proving to myself that I could still grow, still improve. I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. My mornings became sacred. I'd wake up before dawn, hit the gym, then grab a cup of coffee and sit on my porch, watching the sunrise. It was a small thing, but it felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost in the chaos of the last few years. Work had always been a priority for me, but now I threw myself into it with new energy. I didn't have anyone else to consider anymore. No one to check in with, no one to balance my schedule around. It was just me, and I liked it that way. I expanded my construction business, taking on bigger projects and hiring a few extra guys to help with the workload. The hustle kept my mind occupied, and seeing tangible results, a completed house, a satisfied client, reminded me that I could still create something worthwhile. The business grew faster than I expected, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something for myself, not for anyone else. One of the surprising things about being single again was realizing how many interests I'd set aside during my marriage. It wasn't Allison's fault, necessarily. It's just what happens when life gets busy. But now, I had time to revisit the things that used to make me happy. I bought a new set of tools and started woodworking again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. There was something therapeutic about shaping raw materials into something useful, something beautiful. It reminded me that even when things fall apart, there's always the potential to rebuild. I also started hiking more, exploring trails I'd always said I'd get to someday. Being out in nature, away from the noise of the world, gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. If I'm being honest, I lost a lot of trust in people after what happened with Allison. It wasn't just her betrayal. It was the lies, the manipulation, and the realization that even the people closest to you can let you down. But as much as I'd lost trust in others, I realized I couldn't afford to lose trust in myself. That was the hardest part. For months, I'd been second-guessing every decision, replaying every moment, wondering what I could have done differently. But eventually, I had to let that go. I had to accept that her choices were her own, and they didn't define me. So I made a promise to myself. I'd trust my gut, even if it meant taking risks. I'd stop doubting my worth just because someone else had failed to see it. One of the biggest turning points came when I sold the house. I thought it would feel like giving up, but it didn't. It felt like shedding old skin, letting go of a weight I'd been carrying for too long. My new place wasn't as big or as fancy, but it was mine. No shared memories, no reminders of what could have been. Just a clean slate. I kept the decor simple, functional furniture, a few framed photos of my buddies from the Marines, and a corner dedicated to my woodworking projects. It wasn't much, but it felt like home. One night, as I sat on my porch with a cold beer in hand, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter, and I wasn't sad. For the first time in years, I felt content. The scars from Allison's betrayal would always be there, but they didn't define me. They were just part of my story, not the whole thing. I wasn't in a rush to date or find someone new. That part of my life could wait. Right now, I was focused on being the best version of myself. The guy I'd always wanted to be but had somehow lost along the way. I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was enough. Looking back, I realized that everything I'd been through had taught me something important. You can't control what other people do, but you can control how you respond. I'd been knocked down, but I'd gotten back up. I'd rebuilt my life piece by piece, and in the process, I'd rediscovered parts of myself I thought were gone forever. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't afraid of the challenge. I'd been through worse, and I knew I could handle whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving.